For today's video, I want to do a guide for Steampunk, Silkpunk, and Gaslamp fantasy. Before jumping into the many different stories that oftentimes are associated with these subgenres, I wanted to actually define what these subgenres are, because while they are used quite interchangeably, technically there are specifications that distinguish them from one another. So kicking things off, Gaslamp is actually more historical, whereas Steampunk is more focused on innovation. Hence you'll see Gaslamp considered a subgenre of fantasy, and more specifically an offshoot of historical fantasy, while Steampunk has its origins actually more in association with sci-fi, especially when you factor in the emphasis on flight, usually in the form of some kind of airship. Other distinctions and easy to remember elements associated with each: Gaslamp feels urban, it's more supernatural and magical, whereas Steampunk feels more technological. There's usually some kind of industrial revolution component, and if it helps, you can think of it as retro futurism. Then from there we have Silkpunk. Steampunk's technological advancements are rooted in gears, coal, brass, and of course steam. And then Silkpunk, of course, has silk, but also other natural substances like paper and bamboo. Steampunk is often associated with European origins, whereas Silkpunk is often associated with Asian-inspired stories. Of course, most of the time we use these terms relatively interchangeably when we are speaking casually. I've done it before. I know a lot of other people have done it before. I think it's okay as long as you're not talking about these in an academic setting or writing a thesis on these. Most people understand what you're referring to when you use one of these labels. It's like if somebody were to say, oh, I love that Beethoven song. Nobody likes it when the person goes, actually, it's called a piece. We know what people are talking about and we know what people are referring to, so I completely understand. These are somewhat more of an umbrella categorization, even though they do technically have their differences. As I was starting to invest time in a lot of the different stories that fall under these categorizations, whether they were recommendations from all of you or they are just books in general that get pointed to all the time as examples of these subgenres, I was initially approaching this as, okay, which of these three do these stories fall within? But what I actually found to be more helpful is recognizing that while these are subgenres in and of themselves, there are actually subcategories within these. So how I'm going to approach this today is that as I go through the many different stories, I wanted to ensure that all of you had an idea of what you're getting into, an idea of whether or not it would work for you without feeling like you know the ins and outs of the entire story. So in order to accomplish this and ensure that you have that feeling that a lot of us crave and miss from our childhoods, where we didn't have social media, we didn't have huge fandoms, we didn't know, it felt like, so much about the stories before we jumped into it. Rather, we would see something, a cover, a synopsis. We would even just see the spine of a book at our library. We would give it a go, and then we would find out and discover if it was something we really enjoyed. In order to try and replicate that feeling as much as possible, you already have the entire concept of this, which is that these fall under Steampunk, Gaslamp, and Silkpunk. I want to separate these stories by then their subcategories so that you have a good idea of whether or not it would work for you without having a flood of information that just reveals the entirety of the story. You can kind of think of it as a lot of times we have genre benders, things that are formally combining two very distinct genres. So for example, sci-fantasy, we have Gideon the Ninth. Fantasy mystery, we have the new release, The Raven Scholar from 2025. And then often T. Kingfisher gets pointed to as combining fantasy and horror together. How we're structuring this, to put it simply, is that we are doing subgenre bending. So what those subgenres are going to be, we have fairy tale, new weird, romantasy, arcane punk, noir mystery, historical, flintlock, and action adventure. As for the stories themselves, I have primarily made up this list of books, but for those of you that have aphantasia, I wanted to also include visual mediums of storytelling, so that way the aesthetic of Steampunk, Gaslamp, and Silkpunk, which is pretty distinct, you can see something and have it right there in front of you, so that way you're included on this. Because I do think that one of the downsides to this subgenre is that there is this almost inherent, oh, people know what we're talking about, it's steampunk, there's gears. Even though, of course, there's descriptions written into the work, sometimes there's this general idea that people already have this understanding. And I think this is where visual mediums really get to shine with this subgenre, because they can really bring it to life in a way that is more inclusive to people with aphantasia. So not only are we going to go through a lot of different books, but I'm going to mention some other stories as well that are either video games or shows or anime, manga That way you have a huge mix of things to try and check out, and with those other mediums, I am also going to be placing them in the subcategories. Officially jumping into the subcategorization. So the first ones I wanted to start off with were the ones that there was only one book each that fit within these. So we have New Weird, Historical, and Flintlock. Given that Ken Liu is oftentimes in association with the entire concept of Silkpunk, I wanted to go ahead and start with that one with Grace of Kings. Grace of Kings, the subcategorization for this one is going to be historical, as if you look at people who are both fans of this and also people who have criticisms of this series, it is oftentimes rooted in the fact that this so heavily is based in real historical events. The thing that turns us into Silkpunk is the way that you have almost this gods among us perspective within the story. You are seeing how much the players on the board, the characters within the story, are potentially manipulated by the gods or pushed along by the gods. And then, of course, you have certain technological advancements that didn't exist within that actual time period. Mistborn Era 2 is honestly a subgenre bender to the extreme, as we could have put this in action adventure. We could have even put it in mystery / noir if we wanted, because there is a detective component to this. But I think the thing that comes to mind for a lot of people is Flintlock, because of the emphasis on the weaponry that they use within this. So if you don't know anything about Mistborn, there are powers that people have that are associated with ingesting metals. However, within Era 2, you do have characters also starting to use guns. But also, even when you're talking about the distinction between Gaslamp and Steampunk, there are technological innovations within this that make it feel a little bit more steampunk. In fact, Brandon Sanderson's works are often pointed to as feeling more so like sci fantasy because of how much it truly can feel like an entirely different planet, a different ecosystem, and I do think that that's true for the Mistborn eras as well. However, there's also a huge emphasis on magic within this, which tends to lean toward Gaslamp. The thing is, it doesn't feel quite like supernatural or urban either. There is kind of this Wild West feel to the setting. Flintlock is the subcategory I wanted to put this within, just because I think there's so little Flintlock fantasy out there, and this one does get brought up quite often within that. Then, of course, Perdido Street Station. And part of what makes New Weird interesting and fascinating and a little bit different is that it almost kind of soaks up steampunk within it. So where most of these steampunk is the main subgenre and these are subcategories of it, New Weird is almost the opposite. It's almost like New Weird is above and steampunk is an ingredient within the recipe, because oftentimes you have things like steampunk or Gaslamp mixed with horror and fantasy or horror and sci-fi, and that's very true for Perdido Street Station. It's really off the walls. It is truly very weird. It's kind of entirely based on what if we rejected the typical sword and sorcery and we just embraced all these other things from all these other forms of speculative fiction. And I always think of it as, what if you took the aesthetic of Final Fantasy? Of course, there's many Final Fantasy games, but let's say Final Fantasy X, for example. If you took the aesthetic of Final Fantasy X and you made it gross, grimy, and grimdark, you would get something a lot closer to what you have within Perdido Street Station. I mentioned noir mystery in association with Mistborn Era 2, so we'll go ahead and jump into that one now. We have 3 for this one: Legacy of Brightwash, Jacoby, and A Master of Djinn. Jacoby 100% fits more so within Gaslamp than it does Steampunk. It's less so about innovation and technology, and it's more so about the urban components. However, they're also solving crimes within this story, so that's why I wanted to put it into the mystery category, because you are going to have this sort of detective, and you're following this detective's apprentice as they are trying to figure out supernatural cases. A Master of Djinn is another one where it's a little bit more of a blend, I would say, of Steampunk and Gaslamp. It doesn't necessarily 100% fit into either, and it doesn't necessarily have its origins either in the Silkpunk setting or in our typical Victorian era that we think of with Steampunk. It does things a little bit different. So this one is good if you're looking for something that doesn't quite feel like anything you've experienced before in its setting, but has some familiar story beats because of the mystery component. Our third one for this category is Legacy of Brightwash. I would have just had this be mystery, but it's thanks to this book that I felt the need to include noir, because noir has a much grittier feel to it. And absolutely, Legacy of Brightwash does not have the fun. It isn't campy. It's exceptionally heavy, serious. It's really holding up a mirror to our own society through its fictional one, and it's tackling a lot of really serious issues. When it comes to whether it's Gaslamp or Steampunk, I actually would say this one fits more comfortably in Steampunk, because while the emphasis on innovation isn't quite the same in this, it does have a revolution component to it. You see the way that wealthy individuals are trying to capitalize. You see the way that the little man makes hardly anything and they fall victim to those who have a lot more. And also those who have a lot more control the railroads and then they profit from those things. And it's just kind of another means of gaining resources and also hoarding resources. And so it's examining a lot of those things. You're not going to have that sense of wonder that you sometimes get with Steampunk, but also it's not Gaslamp really, because of the fact that it doesn't have the supernatural components quite in the same way. Is there magic in this? Are there things that we don't have in our own world? Yes, but they're not rooted in things like vampires and werewolves and other such kinds of creatures. It really does stand on its own while having a steampunk noir flair. After that, we have the Romantasy category. So I don't actually think either of these books are romantasy or fantasy romance. However, they do have components to them that are related to it. So if you are somebody who you like fantasy books, you're interested in things that are steampunk or Gaslamp, and you like a good romantic subplot, these ones are going to have it. The first one is adult, the second one is young adult. So we'll go ahead and kick it off with that first one, which would be Soulless by Gail Carriger. This one is probably the best at epitomizing the difference between Gaslamp and steampunk, as this one very comfortably fits in Gaslamp. We are looking at a much more urban feel, but set in a more posh Victorian era setting. And we follow a character who does have some connections to supernatural beings, and what those are, the title of the book kind of indicates to you. It's not a spoiler, it's kind of right from the get-go, the thing that makes her distinct. It really does feel like urban fantasy. If you were to take this exact same story and put it in a different setting, it would still work. You would just have to tweak some of the environment around the characters, but it feels very reminiscent of urban fantasy. As for Infernal Devices, the first book in this actually felt exceptionally similar to Soulless. So if you like one, there's a decent chance you'll like the other one. I do think Soulless is a little bit campier, a little bit funnier, and it doesn't take itself too seriously. It does have that kind of British humor to it, whereas Infernal Devices is a little bit more melodramatic, and I definitely think it sucks you in. It feels like the stakes are really high. Of course, many of you are aware this is part of the Shadowhunter series. Can you read this in and of itself without reading all those others? Yes, you don't have to read all the others to have context for this. And where, yes, you do have some of those supernatural beings like werewolves and vampires, there are other forces within this as well that are a little bit more so rooted in things like demonic entities or angels. Now for the fairy tale subcategorization, these are, in my opinion, some of the hardest to pin down whether they're steampunk or Gaslamp or Silkpunk, because they definitely have the ingredients to them. They definitely, you can see within their makeup, fit within these subgenres, but they also don't fit super comfortably. Where Soulless was a perfect example of Gaslamp, all of these feel like, well, they have a little bit of this, they have a little bit of this. There's actually these various things that made them difficult to formally place within Steampunk, Gaslamp, or Silkpunk that I actually think indicated a little bit stronger that they fit within fairy tale, because of course, many of us are aware we've read fairy tales for so long, and fairy tales oftentimes are the origins for a lot of fantasy works in general. They have a sense of whimsy, they almost feel nonsensical at times, and they don't seem to follow things in a rigid, more scientific type of way. So where we have hard magic systems in a lot of times works that are more science oriented, here we have things that are a little bit softer, and sometimes it doesn't feel like things are happening for any rhyme or reason, but that's sort of not the point. You follow these characters as they fall into these almost Alice in Wonderland-like settings. Feels as though they don't have a lot of control over what's going on around them, but they're trying to find agency within the bizarre. And the first two books I'm going to mention within this fit that perfectly, which would be A Winter's Promise and Senlin Ascends. The idea of the Alice in Wonderland comparison I think is apt, because both of these really do have this character that's sort of a fish out of water. They're in this environment they're not familiar with, and they are just trying to figure out how to get by. A Winter's Promise has one of the most lush, interesting worlds in that you do have what previously was some kind of fracturing. So you have these floating islands that have developed over many, many years, their own culture, their own customs, and we see our main character is being married off to somebody from another floating island, and once she is there, everything is outside of her norm. She doesn't know how to fit in. Everybody seems like they have their own motivations, and all of those motivations feel relatively evil or selfish. So it seems like everybody is villainous, including the very person that she's been betrothed to. She doesn't know who she can trust, what she's doing, and she's just trying to get by. With Senlin Ascends, there is this tower where when he goes to arrive at this place, his wife disappears, he gets separated from her, and now he's ascending the tower, and each level is weirder and more intense than the last, but he's continuing to go through this tower in hopes that he can find and rescue his missing wife. You can see the comparisons to things like Alice in Wonderland and why they fit within this sort of fairy tale feel. What makes them somewhat associated with steampunk is that they do have settings that have these components or have certain technological advancements. However, while both of these get pointed to within this subgenre, I wouldn't say either of them are good candidates to represent it perfectly. They are books that are doing things so differently that you aren't going to find too many other stories that feel all that familiar in these settings. Senlin Ascends, maybe you could say there's some familiarity because of the fact that they have this sort of Tower of Babel feel, but then with Winter's Promise, we don't really see too many stories with just floating island cultures. And when I say floating, I mean in the air, not just in the water. So the world building in A Winter's Promise is very fascinating. It's very different, even if the almost fairy tale feel has that sense of grounding you. The other three within this category are all ones that are not necessarily books. Of course, there is that exception of Howl's Moving Castle because there was a book originally, but Howl's Moving Castle, we do see a backdrop within this story that has steampunk settings or steampunk advancements. Lies of P is the one that is the most kind of grim fairy tale looking in its aesthetic, but it absolutely fits the grim fairy tale because of the fact that it is a literal retelling of Pinocchio. It's a retelling of Pinocchio with a steampunk Gaslamp setting, but setting, you'll notice, is being used almost interchangeably at this point with aesthetic. And I think that's one of the key differences between when something feels formally like it fits within this genre versus when it feels like it's borrowing. This one feels like it's borrowing from that aesthetic, and it's a very cool aesthetic. So I can understand why a lot of people are drawn to it. I myself really do like it, but it's kind of pushing outside of what you typically find. And I'm actually okay with this. I don't mind that these don't fit super comfortably because I think the more comfortably something fits within a subgenre, the more you start to lean into the issue of repetition, falling on the same tropes over and over again, and I think it's important to allow things to breathe and allow things to feel a little bit different. This one just feels like the perfect example of, on paper, visually, it 100% has that dark, grim steampunk feel. It just doesn't necessarily borrow in its storytelling beats as often from a steampunk setting. Next up we have Arcane Punk. No surprise here that the show Arcane fits within this. The other story that's going to fit within this would be Blood over Brighthaven. Arcane Punk is something that I would love to look into more because I think that this is where I find that my interests lie, because while I really like so many of the stories that are within this list today, something about this setting that I find absolutely captivating. And so if you have no idea what Arcane Punk even is, it's where you have more of a balance between innovation and also magic. They're a little bit more intertwined, and also they work together for things that feel futuristic and awe-inspiring, which is why I think the show Arcane is so perfectly titled, because that absolutely describes that story. Yes, its aesthetic feels very Gaslamp, but it doesn't have, once again, the typical ingredients that you would find within Gaslamp, like that urban feel with paranormal, but it has magical components to it. It's just its magic feels way more over the top, and it feels like the stakes can be way bigger, or it feels like the possibilities are a lot bigger. It feels exceptionally magical. However, there's also scientific components as well, and this fits really well with the characters themselves, who are actually trying to explore science and how they can harness the power of the arcane, which is perfect. It's a perfect way to describe how these things are blended. It does have a lot of emphasis on how can we have these incredibly innovative solutions to problems? How can we traverse the skies? How can we have travel between other locations where we just go through a portal and we've arrived? How do we do all of that in a way where we're utilizing technology in combination with magic? And I think that Blood Over Brighthaven fits within this really well also, because I have seen a lot of people say Blood Over Brighthaven is steampunk or Gaslamp. But then when you're looking at the definitions of steampunk and Gaslamp, I kept thinking, I understand that the aesthetic fits, but for some reason it doesn't feel like the story quite fits accurately. And I think that's because it's better suited for arcane punk. I was tempted to actually make arcane punk its own fourth subgenre that we were exploring today, but for the sake of not having things be too all over the place, I decided to make it a subcategory, but I really want to read more things within this. I'm actually going to give an additional recommendation for this, which would be the epic fantasy trilogy by R.S. Ford that starts with Engines of Empire. As in the past, I had described that one as somewhat steampunk, but I actually do now think it fits more so within arcane punk. And surprise, surprise, I also really loved the setting of that story. There is a little bit of the kind of Industrial Revolution feel within that, because part of the catalyst for what's moving the plot forward is this sense of unrest in the population, but there's also kind of this warring feel between past and present, and that's represented through the guilds and the church is trying to take advantage of the disgruntled feeling, to put it lightly, that the general population has with the guilds. And then on top of all of that, you have old magic and new magic, and the new magic is also trying to harness that power of the, I'll call it arcane, even though they don't call it that within the story, but they're kind of trying to harness the power of the arcane, but through technology. So you have magic that feels a little bit more familiar to your characters, and then you have magic that feels bizarre and completely unknown. And that juxtaposition I find fascinating. It just feels like the possibilities are endless. And it still feels like there's some control over things, because again, there's that hard magic versus soft magic distinction. It feels like it's borrowing from a little bit of both. Then we have our action adventure subcategory, and this one is the one that is the most full. So first off, we have Of Jade and Dragons, and this is one of the other Silkpunk inspired stories that is on this list. You follow a character who joins in this school setting to try and not only hone her skills that are more so associated with things that we think of when we think of steampunk, but also to try and get to the bottom of what happened to her father, who was recently killed. Aeronaut's Windlass and Foundryside are two books that get pointed to as steampunk by a lot of readers. I think Aeronaut's Windlass very well fits within steampunk. I think Foundryside a little bit less so. Once again, to repeat the same phrase, I think it's borrowing from the aesthetic really well, but this one just is so off the walls. And also I think it's a little bit closer to sci fantasy in a lot of ways. I recognize, and I think it's totally fine if people call it steampunk, but if you are looking for something that truly captures the steampunk feel, I don't know if Foundryside is the best fit. When I was first wanting to do this guide into steampunk, I asked all of you your recommendations, and I even said, just for the record, I've read Aeronaut's Windlass. You don't need to recommend that one. And I still got a bunch of people that said, Aeronaut's Windlass, it's absolutely the perfect steampunk book. And I understand why a lot of people feel that way. You do have that kind of sense of wonder that the innovation side of things provides, because you do have these people that have these airships. I do think that this one has some similarities to what you'll find in a lot of Final Fantasy games, because there is just that sense of wonder and exploration and innovation all baked into one. I do want to note that for those of you who have checked out the Dresden Files, because that's what most people associate with Jim Butcher, and you think, I don't know if I would like the other series because maybe Dresden Files didn't really work for you, I do think that they are separate enough from one another. I think that they both have a sense of fun and a sense of adventure, hence why I'm putting this one under the action-adventure subcategory. However, I do think that Aeronaut's Windlass is written in a way where it's not going to feel exactly the same. There's a chance that if one didn't work for you, the other might still. Wickwire Watch, I would say maybe fits better within Gaslamp fantasy. However, it also gets very off the walls. And it also gets really over the top. There are pieces of this one that remind me a little bit, just a little bit, of The Strength of the Few. Not in its initial setup. That by no means is similar, but just kind of some of the implications of things and where things go within the plot. I can't really think of too many other things that have similarities, but it starts out really small scale, where you're following a man and then also this boy who seems to be getting caught up in a lot of trouble. And then he gets caught up within this group that seems somewhat rebellious, and you're questioning if what you've heard about this group and also what he's heard about this group, if any of that is even true or not. An Alchemy of Masks and Mirrors, I actually think is semi-similar to Aeronaut's Windlass. If you like Brandon Sanderson's world building, there's a chance that you will like this one. If you like the idea of a Sanderson book with a more steampunk feel to it, with the airships and those sorts of things, then I would say there's a decent chance that you enjoy this one. It kind of has like a rakish character who is very protective of this young woman, and there is, once again, an enormous sense of adventure within this story. Stormglass, I put it in action-adventure, even though I think it's a little bit slower going, and this one, you follow a character who has been adopted by a relatively well-off family, and they care about innovation, and they're trying to use innovation to help society, but it doesn't seem like everybody who has wealth, like this family does, is necessarily concerned with this. The other perspective you get within the story is a young girl who is probably going to eventually rule over everyone, and she is determined to learn everything she can about her people so that she can be a good ruler. However, her family doesn't necessarily care about that. They just care about making her this perfect puppet. So you're kind of following these two characters as they are living very different lives from one another. But what happens with both of them is going to likely play a role with each other. And then, of course, we have Full Metal Alchemist. This one, I would say, leans more into steampunk, but there are some Gaslamp components, you could say. I think the tricky thing about the action-adventure category is that when I say about things like Foundry Side or Wickwire Watch that they go off the walls and they just start to really have intense stakes, first off, that is exceptionally true. It is very true for Full Metal Alchemist, the level that the stakes have as you get further in. Pretty enormous. What I find really interesting about this subcategory within steampunk is that unlike action-adventure overall, I actually think in the context of steampunk, it's more so saying, what if that's our setting and that's kind of our base of operation, you could say, but then from there we branch out and we break everything down and then we do something extraordinary. Of course, action-adventure can be its own subgenre, but if we think of it as a subcategory of other genres, for example, quest fantasy, action-adventure within quest fantasy, it feels like you have a set goal you're working toward, and then it can feel kind of episodic, or it can feel like we're going through a lot of things that are familiar story beats, and maybe what is within those familiar story beats can be different, or it can be very character-oriented, but it always kind of has the ball moving forward. And Foundry Side, Full Metal Alchemist, some of the other ones I've mentioned from this category, they start you out with something that fits within steampunk or fits within Gaslamp. And then there's this enormous explosion of incredible world building, interesting storytelling. Of course, whether one works for you or it doesn't, it's going to depend on person to person. How much do you connect with this story? How invested are you to follow along with the craziness that ensues? Full Metal Alchemist, always, forever, one of my favorite stories of all time. It starts out seeming as though you're just following these two young boys who there was an accident when they were young involving alchemy, and now they are trying to right their wrongs, you could say. The further in you get, the more that you see corruption, the more you see the involvement of the military in some absolutely horrible things in history, and you start to open up even the characters, and you get so many more people, and you get this enormous cast, and they're all so rootable, so likable. Even the villains, you find yourself being like, this guy sucks, but also he's so cool. So, I mean, I love Full Metal Alchemist. Any chance to shout from the rooftops about it because I think it's great. But it's kind of a mix of steampunk and Gaslamp because, yes, there's the steam innovations. You have things like trains. They even have phones. They'll call each other, not necessarily cell phones, but they can call each other from time to time. So you see innovation. The innovation is somewhat connected to magic because of the alchemy component, so then you're like, well, that feels a little bit like Arcane punk. But then there are some other beings that, while not necessarily vampires and werewolves, there are some other beings that feel a little bit closer to supernatural, you could say. So it's really a hybrid of a lot of different things, and it's a blast. And it's also really funny, and I highly recommend it. But I wanted to mention one other today. I didn't mention it as its own subcategory because I actually think that it is just its own thing. But it also fit within steampunk pretty well, so I wanted to mention it also, and that would be the grimdark series Age of Madness by Joe Abercrombie. So I think most people, when they think of Joe Abercrombie, with the exception of maybe The Devils and of course his YA series, but when you think of his First Law world, the first thing that comes to mind is grimdark. So that's why I have this one kind of as an asterisk off to the side. However, Age of Madness has that kind of industrial revolution feel. What's somewhat interesting is that a lot of times within these sorts of settings, there is this feeling of rebellion. You don't like the way that the wealthy are taking advantage of the working class. You want to push back against that, and that's what can be the momentum that leads to a revolution. However, in this, you're kind of looking at the people responsible for the exploitation of other individuals as just a small snippet of what this story entails. You do want to likely start with the First Law trilogy. Technically, you can start with Age of Madness, but you're going to have certain context not available to you if you haven't read First Law first. I'm a big fan of First Law. It does not fit within the categories today. First Law is sort of taking the typical hero's journey, and then it's doing a subversion of that. And it's almost a little bit having the flavor of satire as well. Whereas Age of Madness is, I think, a little bit more... They're both rooted in society, absolutely, and part of the whole thing with grimdark is it's bleak to reflect realism. But I do think Age of Madness, it doesn't feel as much like it's trying to subvert something, unless you consider the fact that instead of looking at the revolutionaries, for the most part, you're looking at the people that make people want to start a revolution, so I guess in that sense. But it's more like you're just examining the characters that you don't normally examine, rather than what if I subverted the entirety of this familiar fantasy concept. Regardless, it does fit within steampunk pretty well, and it is one of my favorites actually on this list. Speaking of favorites, I thought I'd go ahead, now that we're at the end of this, let you know what my favorites among all of these are. And also, one, if you'd like to give any of your own recommendations, please feel free to do that so people have a whole other list of things to check out besides just the things I talked about today. If I have gone more in depth with these and you are somebody who prefers to hear a little bit more, then I'll have those videos linked so that you can hear more about them. And I'll have everything in a pinned comment so that you have ease of access and you can easily reference back to anything. But when it comes to my favorites, if you have recommendations, not just for other people, but for me, based off the ones I like selfishly, please feel free to let me know. If I'm just sticking with books, my favorites for these, I just mentioned, I do of course love the Age of Madness trilogy. It's one of my favorite trilogies of all time. One of my favorite series of all time, not just talking about trilogies. I also absolutely loved Blood Over Brighthaven. It's very on the nose with its themes. It is very blunt with its themes, but I absolutely loved the progression of the plot. I loved the way that we combined all of these various different pieces, the grayness of the character, to put it lightly. I thought it was phenomenal. Legacy of Brightwash, I've read the first one. I thought it was amazing. I thought it was very well executed. I look forward to reading the sequel. However, the reason I haven't continued on with the sequel yet is because the third book isn't out, and I am worried about the emotional devastation I'll be left with after the second one. And I won't have any means of closure because the next one won't be out yet. But I absolutely highly recommend Legacy of Brightwash. Again, it is very heavy. My favorites, if it wasn't obvious, have some pretty serious things within them, but I think all of these are incredible. If I open up, and I'm not just talking about books, but I include the other mediums as well, pretty much everything that falls within the other category are also on my list of favorites. I love Studio Ghibli's Howl's Moving Castle. I think it's whimsical. I think it's beautiful. I think that there is kind of this bittersweetness to it. I love Arcane. I think it's incredible. A feat when it comes to also just the animation in general, but also I think the characters are great. I think the world is incredible. I was invested in not only the individual characters' plot lines, but just the greater plot overall also. Fullmetal Alchemist, I've said it for years, one of my favorite stories ever. Not just within anime and manga, but any kind of story. Fullmetal Alchemist to this day is still one of the best stories I've ever encountered. I think it's absolutely incredible. Lies of P is a great game. I would say the story maybe isn't the most unique necessarily. I mean, the fact that it's a retelling probably gives that away. But I really, really enjoy the game itself. Exceptionally challenging, but the whole look and the design of things is really fantastic, and I have played through it multiple times. I have a blast with it. I am very curious to know how many of you before this realized that there was such a distinction between Gaslamp, Silkpunk, and Steampunk, and then also now that you've had a more formal definition provided, would you say you're kind of surprised at some of the books that get pointed to as representations of these subgenres? Because I know I was a little bit surprised. Of course, a lot of the books that I picked up because they were recommended to me as oh, these are the perfect suggestions for this subgenre, and some of them I thought were, and some of them a little less so. And I was still ultimately very happy to read a lot of these. I feel like I have a much better understanding of what this subgenre has to offer, but also now it just makes me want to go down the rabbit hole, as I said, of what Arcane Punk is and see what that subgenre has to offer. I also would love to know, of all the books mentioned, what are your top picks from all of these, and feel free to include some of the other works from other mediums as well. And then the last thing is, if you liked this style of guide, are there other subgenres that you would like me to do these mini deep dives into? Because I would be happy to do so. It does take a while because there's so many different books to read, and part of why it took me so long to get around to this one is because the further in I was getting and the more books I was reading, the more I felt like they were pretty different from each other, and I wanted to have a wider view of what this subgenre represented. Or I guess in this case we can say these subgenres represented, because they do have those distinctions. But anyway, on that note, if you would like to reference back to any of the books that I talked about today, I will have a pinned comment with a lot of relevant information. Thanks so much for watching though. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.